Picture this. It's 6:30 a.m., January 1974. You're 6 years old, buried under a mountain of wool blankets and an old overcoat that weighs more than you do. You don't want to move. You can't move, because the air in your bedroom, it's not just cold, it's sharp, it's biting. You reach out a hand, brr, and there it is, the great British tradition no one asked for, ice on the inside of the window. Not a light dusting either. We're talking a thick, crystalline crust that looks like nature's own jagged wallpaper. Now let's get real for a second. We look back at this and think, oh, how quaint. But let's look at the logic. Why was it so freezing? In 1970, only about 31% of British households had central heating. Think about that. Nearly 70% of the country was living in what we'd now call fuel poverty. Toss in the 1973 oil crisis and the 3-day week, and suddenly staying warm wasn't a utility, it was a strategic operation. You'd grab a 10p piece or a plastic ruler and scritch, scritch, scritch. You'd carve your name into the frost just to see the grey street outside. It was your first lesson in physics. Heat is a luxury, and it belongs strictly to the ground floor. There's a logic here that people miss today. We talk about resilience and mental toughness like there's something you buy in a self-help book. But back then, resilience was the 5-second sprint from your icebox bedroom down the drafty stairs to the one spot in the house that didn't feel like the Arctic Circle, the rug in front of the coal fire. If you weren't the first one down, you were fighting for floor space. You'd stand there, backside to the flames, smelling the singe of your pajamas while your toes thawed out on the cold lino. Tst, that's the sound of reality hitting. The reverse logic angle. Here's what people rarely admit. We might have been poor by modern standards, but that cold created a weird kind of intimacy. You couldn't retreat to your bedroom to play video games or scroll on a phone. You had to be in the same room as your family because that was the only place where you wouldn't catch hypothermia. The cold forced us together. It turned a house into a huddle. And honestly, sometimes I think the comfort of modern central heating has made us a bit soft. We've traded that raw communal survival for individual thermostats, and I'm not entirely sure we won that deal.
I remember a neighbor, Mr. Henderson, who used to say, if you can see your breath, you know you're still breathing. It sounds grim, doesn't it? But there was a pride in it. We're all in this together grit that you just don't find in a centrally heated, double-glazed world. But the cold was just the beginning, because while we were thawing out our toes, the real heart of the 70s home, that big, bulky wooden box in the corner, was waiting to demand its tribute. Now let's talk about the fickle god in the corner of the room, the television. In the 2020s, we buy a 50-inch 4K screen with a few clicks and forget about it. But in 1974, a color TV was a high-stakes investment. A new set cost around £225. To put that in perspective, the average weekly wage was about £40. You're looking at nearly 6 weeks' salary for a wooden box that might blow a valve the moment you turn it on. That's why the high streets were dominated by names like Radio Rentals, DER, and Rumbelows. By the mid-70s, it's estimated that over 70% of colour TV sets in Britain were rented. We didn't own our entertainment, we subscribed to it, long before Netflix was a glimmer in anyone's eye. You'd turn it on and wait, for the valves to warm up. There was that specific smell, wasn't there? A mix of warm dust and ozone wafting from the back of the set. But the real drama wasn't on the screen during the generation game. The real drama was happening inside the electric meter. The meter was the silent auditor of your life. It sat in the cupboard under the stairs or high on a wall, ticking away like a hungry mechanical beast. And its diet? 10p pieces. Clunk. That was the sound of survival. Everything was going fine, you're halfway through a sitcom, the kettle is just about to whistle, and then, flicker, flicker, the lights dim. A collective groan goes up from the sofa. The meter's gone. Then came the frantic, high-stakes hunt. It was like a domestic archaeological dig. You'd check the kitchen drawer, empty the everything jar, feel down the back of the sofa cushions, clink, hoping to find that one silver savior. If nobody found one, total darkness. The fickle god went black.
The logic gap people miss. We often hear people say, "Why didn't they just save up?" or "That's an expensive way to live." But they're missing the point. The coin meter and the rental contract weren't just about poverty, they were about budgeting for a world without credit cards. There was no buy now, pay later app. There was just the weekly visit from the radio rentals man or the catalogue lady. It was a pay-as-you-go existence that kept you out of the clutches of the big banks, even if it meant sitting in the dark for 20 minutes while your dad ran to the pub to change a pound note for 10 bob bits. A personal observation. I remember my Uncle Arthur once telling me that the happiest sound of his week wasn't the weekend bell at the factory, it was the thunk of the 10p hitting the bottom of the meter after a long shift, because it meant the house was alive again. There was a strange, shared honesty in it. You'd look down the street at 8 p.m. and see one house go dark, then 5 minutes later the lights would pop back on. You'd smile to yourself and think, "Found a coin then." We were all tied to the same mechanical heartbeat. But even when the TV was working and the lights were on, your privacy was never truly yours, because while you were watching the telly, someone else, someone with a lace curtain and a very sharp eye, was almost certainly watching you. If the 10p meter was the heartbeat of the home, the net curtain was the skin. Every working-class window in the 1970s was draped in layers of white starched lace. And let's be clear, those curtains weren't there for interior design, they were a two-way intelligence system. From the outside, they signalled respectability. If your nets were grey or sagging, the street's social jury had already reached a verdict on your character. But from the inside, they were a high-tech camouflage for the twitcher. Every street had one. Usually it was a woman like Mrs. Gable at number 42. She didn't need a job. Her career was the window. You'd see it, twitch, just a half-inch movement of the lace. Rustle. That was the sound of the neighbourhood's unofficial CCTV system, recording your arrival.
Now, we live in an age of encrypted messaging and Ring doorbells, but in 1975, the social internet was a neighbour leaning over a garden fence with a cup of tea. If you tripped on the curb 3 streets away, your mother knew about it before you'd even wiped the gravel off your knee. The logic flip, why privacy is overrated. We spend billions today on home security. We crave privacy. We build 6-foot fences and buy tinted glass. But back then, we had zero privacy, and yet we were infinitely safer. Think about the logic. A twitcher didn't just notice if you were misbehaving. They noticed if your milk bottles hadn't been taken in by 10 a.m. They noticed if a stranger was loitering at your gate. According to sociological studies of British terraced life, this eyes-on-the-street phenomenon, a term coined by Jane Jacobs, was the most effective crime deterrent in history. It wasn't Big Brother watching you, it was Big Mother. And let's talk about the police state of the street. If you stepped out of line, Mrs. Gable didn't call the authorities. She'd give you a sharp "Oi!" and maybe a clip round the ear. And the craziest part, your parents wouldn't sue her. They'd thank her. Then they'd give you another one for embarrassing the family. The depth of the connection. I remember a guy from Leeds telling me that when his dad lost his job in '78, no one said a word. But for the next 2 weeks, neighbours kept accidentally making too much stew and needing someone to help eat it. That's the side of the twitcher culture we forget. They saw your business, yes, but they also saw your struggle. The street was a living, breathing organism. You were never unsupervised, which meant you were never truly alone. But while the adults were busy policing the curtains, we, the kids, were busy in the only territory they couldn't fully reach, the asphalt and the alleyways. And our curfew wasn't a watch, it was an orange glow in the sky. If you want to understand the true meaning of freedom, you have to understand the orange glow.
We didn't have GPS trackers, Find My Friend apps, or scheduled playdates. We had a door that opened at 9 a.m. and a voice that said, "Out." That was it. You were released into the wild like a domesticated animal returned to the forest. But there was one absolute unbreakable law. When the streetlights flickered to life, bzzz, hum, the game was over. That low, eerie orange hum of the sodium vapor lamps was our digital leash. If you weren't through the front door by the time that glow reached its full intensity, you weren't just late, you were in trouble. The microeconomy of the gutter. While the adults were dealing with the 3-day week and inflation, we were running a shadow economy in the back alleys. This is where the logic of the 70s really shines. We were the original recyclers, but we didn't do it for the planet, we did it for the sugar. Take the Corona Man. When that lorry turned into the street, clatter, bang, it was like a visit from a king. But the real treasure wasn't just the dandelion and burdock, it was the empty glass bottles. Each one carried a deposit, usually 3p or 5p. Think about the math. A bag of 6 bottles meant you were rich. You'd scour the hedges and the canal banks like a forensic investigator for empties. It taught us a brutal, necessary lesson. Everything has value if you're willing to carry it to the shop. Today we call it circular economics. Back then we called it getting enough for a pack of space raiders. The ghost of the Victorian era. Then there was the rag and bone man. Even deep into the 70s, you'd hear that haunting, guttural shout echoing through the estate. Any old iron, any rag and bone. You'd hear the cloppity-clop of the horses' hooves on the tarmac, a sound that belonged more to the 1870s than the 1970s. We'd scramble to find an old jumper or a rusted saucepan just for the chance of a prize. The salty reality. Usually the prize was a balloon. If you were really lucky or your mum gave up something substantial, you got a goldfish in a plastic bag. Let's be honest, that fish was a short-term investment. It rarely survived the week. But for 5 minutes, walking back to your house with a living creature you'd traded for a holy cardigan, you felt like you'd won life.
People today look at 70s kids and see neglect. They see us unsupervised, playing on building sites and knock-a-door run. But there's a counter-argument. By letting us roam, our parents gave us agency. We learned how to negotiate with the big kids, how to manage a budget of 5 pence, and how to navigate a world that wasn't child-proofed. We weren't unsupervised, we were trusted. There's a massive psychological difference. The 1970s street was a masterclass in social navigation that no iPad can replicate. We weren't just playing, we were practicing being adults. My personal reflection, I remember a friend, Billy, who once traded his dad's old copper piping, which he found in the shed, for a particularly large goldfish. His dad wasn't even mad about the plumbing, he was just impressed by Billy's hustle. That was the 70s spirit. If you can turn old iron into new joy, you're doing all right. But as much as we ruled the streets, the true magic and the true struggle happened back inside the house, behind the steam of the kitchen, where our mothers were performing actual miracles with a tin of corned beef and a single onion. If the street belonged to the kids, the kitchen was the undisputed domain of the miracle workers. Let's be honest, 1970s British cuisine wasn't about flavour profiles or aesthetic plating, it was about fuel. In 1975, inflation in the UK hit a staggering 24.2%. Food prices were skyrocketing. To survive, the working-class mother had to be part accountant, part chemist, and part magician. She'd stand at the stove and you'd hear it, thwack, pop, the sound of a key opening a tin of corned beef. That one tin had to feed 6 people. How? Bulk. You add potatoes, onions, maybe a stray carrot, and suddenly you've got a mountain of hash.
The stretcher logic. We didn't have food waste because there was nothing spare to waste. Stale bread became bread pudding. Sunday's roast, if you were lucky enough to have one, was reincarnated as Monday's cold cuts, Tuesday's stew, and Wednesday's mystery mince. The salty reality. We didn't need a Michelin star, we just needed a layer of gravy thick enough to hide the fact that Tuesday's dinner was actually Sunday's leftovers wearing a different costume. If it was brown and hot, it was proper. The less noticed angle, logic flip. Today we look at 70s food, the Spam fritters, the bread and dripping, the OXO heavy stews, and we call it unhealthy. But here's the logic flip. Those meals were a psychological anchor. In a decade defined by strikes, power cuts, and economic winter of discontent, a hot, heavy meal at 5 p.m. was the ultimate sign of security. It told us that despite what the news said, our world was still holding together. We weren't just eating calories, we were eating certainty. The holy ritual, the chippy. But then there was Friday, the one night the magician took a break. You'd be sent down the road with a few greasy pound notes. You could smell it from 2 streets away, that intoxicating sharp tang of malt vinegar hitting hot beef dripping. Sss, hiss, the sound of fresh batter hitting the fryer. You'd stand in the queue, watching the steam fog up the windows. You'd ask for scraps, the golden bits of leftover batter, and because you were a regular, they'd throw them in for free. Crinkle scrunch, that's the sound of the newspaper being wrapped tight to keep the heat in. The connection. Walking home with that warm, heavy bundle against your chest felt like carrying a trophy. We'd all sit in the living room, the only warm room, and eat straight out of the paper. No plates, no washing up, just the salt, the grease, and the glow of the TV. I remember a woman named Eileen who grew up in Salford. She told me, "We lived like paupers all week so we could feel like kings for 20 minutes on a Friday night." That was the 70s contract. We worked hard, we made do, and we earned our joy in small, salt-covered increments. But personal joy was only half the story, because every now and then the social internet of the street would explode into something much bigger, something that turned a row of grey houses into a sea of red, white, and blue. If the 70s was a marathon of making do, then June 7th, 1977 was the finish line where everyone got a medal. The Silver Jubilee. We're talking about a time when the UK was economically battered, but for one Tuesday afternoon, none of that mattered. Imagine the transformation. One day it's a grey, soot-stained street, the next a sea of red, white and blue. Flap, flap, flap. That's the sound of miles of bunting, half of it homemade from bin bags and felt-tip pens, snapping in the British breeze. Trestle tables were dragged out from the local social club and lined up right down the middle of the road. Screech! The sound of wood on asphalt. Suddenly, the social internet of the twitching curtains became a physical reality. We weren't just neighbors, we were one giant, noisy, sandwich-eating family. The salty reality. We weren't all royalists. Half the dads on the street were probably grumbling about the cost of the monarchy while they reached for another sausage roll. But the Jubilee wasn't really about the Queen, it was about us. It was an excuse to prove that even if we were working class, we could still put on a show that would put a palace banquet to shame. The logic of the high-trust society. Statistically, the late 70s were some of the most turbulent years in British history. We had the winter of discontent looming, strikes were everywhere, and the poverty trap was a lived reality for millions. But here's the logic flip that modern sociologists often study. Social cohesion actually peaks during shared hardship.
In 1977, we had a high-trust society. You didn't need a permit to shut down the street. You just did it. You didn't worry about health and safety for the egg and spoon race. Today, we have more money, more safety, and more privacy. But we have lower levels of community trust. We've traded the Jubilee spirit for Ring doorbells and Do Not Disturb signs. The legacy. Why it matters now. People ask, why do you miss it? You were poor, you were cold, and you ate spam. And here is my personal take, the core philosophy of the Nostalgia Brit. We don't miss the lack of money, we miss the clarity. In the 70s, you knew exactly where you stood. You stood with your family, your street, and your mates. There was a grit in the air, literally from the coal smoke, that produced a specific kind of person. A person who doesn't panic when the Wi-Fi goes down, because they remember what it's like to wait 3 hours for a TV valve to cool down. We owe everything to those mothers who stretched the mince and those fathers who fixed the toaster with a bit of wire and a prayer. They didn't just give us life, they gave us a backbone. The final hook. So the next time you see a 10p piece at the bottom of a drawer, don't just see a coin, hear that clunk. Remember the flickering lights. Remember the ice on the inside of the window. And remember that you are part of a generation that didn't just survive the 70s, you were forged by them. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If these memories stirred something in your soul, I want to hear your salty story. Which was it for you? The 10p meter running out during the World Cup, or the smell of your dad's suit coming out of the pawn shop on a Friday? Drop it in the comments below. Let's keep these stories alive, because if we don't tell them, who will? Don't forget to subscribe to the Nostalgia Brit. We've got plenty more memories to unwrap.